God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? Nietzsche's pronouncement that God is dead is perhaps the most widely discussed and yet least understood concept in his philosophy. This is not going to be another video explaining the implications of the death of God on Western culture. There are plenty of those already. Instead, I want to offer a perspective that is rarely discussed, what the death of God means for the individual. I also want to tell the story of the death of God, to explain who killed God and why he did it. In Nietzsche's allegory Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the main protagonist Zarathustra travels through the land and comes upon a valley, a kingdom of death, marked by black and red cliffs. There is no grass, no trees, and no birdsong. It is a valley shunned by all animals, inhabited only by a species of fat, ugly green snakes that come here to die. In this land of serpent death, Zarathustra encounters a hideous figure crouched over. This is the ugliest man. The sight of this unseemly creature fills Zarathustra with pity and shame, and he averts his eyes. As Zarathustra begins to turn away, a noise fills the air which sounds like water gurgling through rattling and clogged pipes. This is the voice of the ugliest man. His voice sounds like the gurgling and rattling of clogged pipes because he is choking. I'll explain why later. The ugliest man challenges Zarathustra to solve a riddle which holds the secret of his identity. The riddle goes, what is the revenge against the witness? You think yourself wise, proud Zarathustra. Then guess the riddle, you cracker of hard nuts, the riddle that I am. Speak then, who am I? Zarathustra answers him thus. I recognize you well. You are the murderer of God. You could not bear him who saw you, who always saw you through and through, you ugliest man. You took revenge on this witness. Zarathustra solves the riddle and understands the reasons behind it. The ugliest man kills God, the ultimate witness who could see him in all his nakedness, even into the depths of his soul. The ugliest man could not live under such scrutiny, so he killed God out of shame. What does it mean that the ugliest man kills the witness out of his shame? The story of the ugliest man is a fable of self-love and self-contempt. According to scholar T.K. Seung, this fable should be understood in reference to Ludwig Andreas von Feuerbach's theory of God in his Essence of Christianity. According to Feuerbach, God is a projection of human ideals. In other words, embodied within the figure of God is the idealization of what humans wish to be. As Feuerbach wrote, the qualities that we attribute to God are precisely the qualities that we value most in ourselves. These include human love and wisdom, as well as our consciousness of our own, subjective existence. The more beautiful the projections were, the more ugly humans appeared to be when measured against such ideals. This explains the feeling of shame the ugliest man felt in the presence of his God, the ultimate witness to his own ugliness. As the ugliest man tells Zarathustra, but he had to die. He saw with eyes that saw everything. He saw man's depths and ultimate grounds, all his concealed disgrace and ugliness. His pity knew no shame. He crawled into my dirtiest nooks. This most curious, over-obtrusive, over-pitying one had to die. He always saw me. On such a witness, I wanted to have revenge or not live myself. The God who saw everything, even man, this God had to die. Man cannot bear it that such a witness should live. The ugliest man feels an unbearable shame and self-contempt in the face of his own projected ideals, so he murders these ideals. By killing God, he disowns the ideal created by his own projections. A God can be killed because he only exists as an ideal, but he can only be killed by the creator of this ideal. The ugliest man says something else that is interesting. He says of his God that his pity knew no shame. Nietzsche claimed that God died from his pity. This is a rather strange thing to say. What does it mean for a God to die from his pity? God saw everything about human beings, how ugly and pitiful they are, and he felt pity for them. This reflects the Christian view of humanity as ugly and worthless in comparison to the power and glory of God. Pity was a contributing factor to the death of God, but not the immediate cause. The ugliest man could not stand that a witness to all his ugliness should live, and worse, that this witness should also feel pity for this ugliness. Paradoxically, the ugliest man kills God because he feels wretched and worthless before such an ideal, but he also does it out of self-love. Despite his ugliness, man still possesses the virtue of self-love. The ugliest man loves and hates himself just as he loves and hates God. This is the true tragedy of the story. As the embodiment of human ideals in murdering God, the ugliest man does violence to a part of himself. This self-love involves great self-contempt, and Nietzsche sees this as a potentially redeeming quality in human beings. When the ugliest man speaks, his voice sounds like the rattling of clogged pipes because he chokes on his disgust with himself. Yet his self-contempt is a hallmark of greatness. He loves and despises himself simultaneously, and this self-contempt drives him to greater heights and accomplishments. How poor man is, after all, how ugly, how wheezing, how full of hidden shame. I have been told that man loves himself. How great must this self-love be? How much contempt stands against it? This fellow too loved himself, even as he despised himself. A great lover he seems to me, and a great despiser. None have I found yet who despised himself more deeply. That too is a kind of height. When we revisit Feuerbach's idea that God is merely a projection of human qualities and ideals, Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead starts to make more sense. Feuerbach argued that humans have cast their best attributes onto the figure of God. By doing so, humans are left with only their imperfections. This projection creates a dichotomy where God embodies all that is pure and good, while humans are burdened with their perceived wretchedness. This contrast can lead to deep resentment. As humans struggle to measure up to this divine ideal, the gap between who they are and who they aspire to be becomes unbearable. The purer and more virtuous God appears, the more flawed and contemptible humans seem by comparison. In this light, the death of God can be seen as a necessary step for humans to reclaim their own qualities and cease the self-loathing fueled by this unattainable ideal. Moreover, the omnipresent nature of this divine witness leaves no room for secrets. Humans, however, need their secrets to preserve their sense of self-worth. Complete self-awareness in individuals without the necessary strength to bear such truths can lead to self-disgust, because it forces individuals to confront their flaws and failures without any buffer. This kind of unfiltered self-knowledge can make one feel pitiful, and pity is inherently offensive to one's sense of pride. Whether it be a God's pity or man's, pity offends the sense of shame. God not only felt great pity towards his creations, but worse, he seemed unable to communicate with them. This hidden God cannot convey his messages to his children, especially in matters of their salvation, resulting in many being condemned to hell simply for misunderstanding him. This is a significant problem apologists face. Why can't their God communicate better? Why all the riddles? This might lead one to feel pity for God because he cannot make his existence and his concern clear to us. Or as Nietzsche writes, must he not then endure almost the torments of hell to see his creatures suffer so, for the sake of knowledge of him, and not be able to help and counsel them, except in the manner of a deaf and dumb man making all kinds of ambiguous signs, when the most appalling danger is about to fall on his child or dog? An oppressed believer who draws this conclusion ought indeed to be forgiven if he feels more pity for this suffering God than he does for his neighbors. This passage from Beyond Good and Evil offers some context to the ugliest man's motives. The ugliest man had a horror of God feeling pity for him, but he also felt pity for his God. Neither God nor man can bear the pity each feels for the other. So the ugliest man kills God to release them both from their joint suffering. How did God's pity contribute to his own death? To understand why we need to understand Nietzsche's genealogy of the Judeo-Christian God. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, we find a summary, of sorts, to his genealogy of the Christian God. When he was young, this God out of the Orient, he was harsh and vengeful, and he built himself a hell to amuse his favorites. Eventually, however, he became old and soft and mellow and pitying, more like a grandfather than a father, but most like a shaky old grandmother. Then he sat in his nook by the hearth, wilted, grieving over his weak legs, weary of the world, weary of willing, and one day he choked on his all-too-great pity. God was once a young and vibrant being who commanded respect and dispensed rewards and punishments according to his will. But over time he became old, feeble, and effeminate, and wanted to be only a God of love. This represents a fundamental inversion of the God of the Old Testament, whom many scholars believe descended from a war god. When Nietzsche says God dies from his pity, he is referring to this process where God transitioned from vibrant and active to feeble and effeminate, from a war god to a God of love. Once embodying vitality, God now symbolizes decadence. Of course, the death of a god cannot be attributed to a single cause, but decadence was a major contributing factor. When gods die, they always die several kinds of death. The death of God becomes an important moment in the history of humanity because of what it signifies. According to Michel Foucault, after the death of God, the death of the subject naturally follows. This is because God had a metaphorical role in the creation of humanity. As long as God exists, the individual cannot transcend himself, as he is still bound by being a subjective essence, immutable and eternal. The concept of God supports traditional knowledge concerning the self, according to Nietzsche. In other words, God is the ultimate concept for preserving the human. Without killing God, humanity cannot overcome itself, so this old tyrant of the soul must die. According to Nietzsche, faith, whether it be in God or some religious doctrine, is slavery in a higher sense. The man of faith, the believer of every kind, is necessarily a dependent man, one who cannot posit himself as an end, one who cannot posit any end at all by himself. The believer does not belong to himself. He can only be a means. He must be used up. He requires somebody to use him up. His instinct gives the highest honor to a morality of self-abnegation. Everything persuades him in this direction: his prudence, his experience, his vanity. Every kind of faith is itself an expression of self-abnegation, of self-alienation. Those who believe in higher ideals such as God or objective morality are slaves to these ideals. The believer lacks the courage or strength of will to create their own goals. They are defined and guided by external forces imposed upon them, and their will bends to conform to these forces. In contrast, the free man is necessarily a skeptic. If he has convictions, they exist only in service to his goals. He uses convictions rather than being used by them. The colloquial wisdom is, if you have no plan, you will become part of someone else's. Some people follow their own path, while others simply follow a figure of authority, whether it be a book, God, the state, an individual, the herd, or anything else they can find. If you play another person's game, whether in language or any other form, you will be determined by others. There's an interesting maxim from Twilight of the Idols, which expresses this idea. He who does not know how to put his will into things at least puts a meaning into them. That is, he believes there is a will in them already. Principle of belief. What Nietzsche means here is that because the believer does not see that there is no higher will working in the world, he is trapped by his understanding, incapable of transforming his world and himself. The free individual, on the other hand, knows that he projects his will into things and can create and sculpt them into things of beauty. He understands that these things exist as he has learned to see them. I found a beautiful illustration of this idea in the work of William Blake. Blake had a unique vision that revolved around the power of imagination and personal will. In his works, Blake often contrasted the believer, who is trapped by conventional religious and societal norms, with the free individual, who recognizes the potency of his own creative will. According to Blake, the believer's entrapment stems from an inability to see beyond the notion of a higher, external will governing the world. This belief system binds the individual, rendering him incapable of transforming his reality or himself. Established dogmas pose a great danger for stagnation in thought, which leads to mental decay, especially in the mind's creative powers. Blake, just like Nietzsche, believed that the free individual is one who acknowledges that it is his own will and imagination which shape the world. As Blake wrote, "The imagination is not a state, it is the human existence itself. The person who knows his imagination and will shape his experience is not bound by external decrees, but is empowered to project his desires and creativity into his surroundings, thus sculpting his reality into something beautiful and meaningful." True freedom and self-realization come from this inner realization. I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. In other words, one must actively construct one's own worldview or suffer from subjugation under imposed doctrines and creeds. Blake asserted that imagination is not just an artistic tool of creation, but a profound force capable of altering our perception and experience. We should guard it carefully and be wary of those doctrines which are not our own that control what we experience and alienate us from our creative will. For Blake, imagination was synonymous with divine insight, a way to transcend the limitations imposed by rigid rationalism and dogma. Imagination is the real and eternal world, of which this vegetable universe is but a faint shadow. By elevating imagination to a divine status, Blake positioned it as the ultimate means through which individuals could achieve true freedom and enlightenment. Blake's thoughts are profoundly similar to Nietzsche's on the power of the creative will and how allowing external forces to define us prevents us from realizing our creative potential. Both of them draw the same distinction between the believer and the free individual. The believer lives a life governed by religious institutions and concepts, which lead him through a perpetual cycle of obedience and passivity. Since he does not exercise his own creative will, it becomes a flaccid appendage that gradually wilts and decays. Whereas the free individual creates their own spiritual and existential narratives, free from the confines of external constructs. This sentiment is powerfully conveyed in his work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he writes, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." Cleansing the doors of perception means freeing ourselves from the narratives which construct our experience. Blake wanted individuals to break free from mental barriers and see the world anew, in all its beauty and infinitude. By purging the mind of restrictive beliefs, one could attain a limitless and profound understanding of the world. The death of God becomes essential to unleashing the creative powers of the mind. This event is not merely the end of a deity, but the beginning of a personal rebirth, where perception is no longer clouded by imposed dogma. It's like clearing a cobweb-covered window, revealing a vibrant and ever-changing landscape outside, a landscape that embodies the eternal becoming inherent in the world. This transformation restores innocence to the process of becoming, allowing one to embrace the world with the wonder of a child. Atheism and a kind of second innocence belong together. Feuerbach's claim that God is the projection of our highest selves reminds me a lot of the way a child idealizes their parents. For the child to mature and become an individual, he must learn to distinguish his self from his parents. The powerful and loving image he has projected onto his parents needs to be weakened, or he cannot assert his own identity. As Carl Jung wrote, "The participation mystique, or primitive identity, causes the child to feel the conflicts of the parents, and to suffer from them as if they were its own. A child under the influence of the participation mystique absorbs the repressed psychic contents of their parents, and this assimilation can hinder the child's own psychological development. For the child to grow and become a unique, healthy individual, it is crucial to sever the complex ties to a parent. Similarly, believers must break free from the concept of God as the projection of their highest values to achieve true self-realization. For man to continue his psychological development, he must sever his connection to his father figure, God, to assert his individual will and feel his power over himself. This is where I disagree with Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung. They both insist that we must rescue the dead father from the belly of the whale, as Jordan Peterson puts it. But I believe this approach leads to childish regression. Instead, we need to mature and develop ourselves, both psychologically and spiritually. Man must become responsible for himself. This is why the death of God becomes necessary. It is only after this figure has been removed that humanity can continue its development and overcome itself. Mankind is under the influence of the participation mystique of its father God. By killing the father, the separation between our highest selves and our current self is diminished. This gives us the chance to re-embody our ideals rather than projecting them onto something outside of us. The qualities we most value are not the attributes of God, but reflections of our highest selves. This is the meaning of Nietzsche's term God-man. That God became man indicates only this, that man should not seek his salvation in eternity, but rather establish his heaven on earth. If we wish to enter the kingdom of heaven, we must become as little children. In other words, we must regress to a childish state, merging with our parents and betraying our own potential for growth, independence, and enlightenment. Instead, we must mature, free ourselves from the participation mystique, and strive to overcome ourselves. To be sure, except ye become as little children, ye shall not enter into that kingdom of heaven. But we have no wish whatever to enter into the kingdom of heaven. We have become men, so we want the earth.